Hi, everybody. My name is Victoria Thompson, and today we're going to be tackling the very fun, very relevant concept of culturally responsive STEM education. So, with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Before we start, here's just a little bit about me. I am a proud product of New Jersey K through 12 public education, and I currently live in the Seattle area. I got my undergraduate degree at the College of Charleston, which is located in Charleston, South Carolina. I have my graduate degree in curriculum and instruction from Western Governors University. I'm a former high school math educator, and my current role is that of a STEM integration transformation coach. And all of my colleagues are currently watching me in the next room over. So Madi, Nina, Denise, and Bethany, I hope I am making you proud. And most of my research specifically focuses on culturally responsive math education, math pathways, and also using technology to help bridge gaps in equity in our schools. So that's about me. Let's talk a little bit just about what culturally responsive STEM education is. And here's what it is. So, culturally responsive STEM education is science, technology, engineering, and math curriculum and instruction that does these following things. First and foremost, it decolonizes curriculum and instructional practices that are harmful to students of color, non-neurotypical students, and also students that do not fit what we like to call the status quo. So essentially, if students don't fit into a neat little box, what is the curriculum and instruction doing for them at that time? And is it going to be helpful or is it going to be harmful? Spoiler alert, it's going to be harmful, so that's why we're going to decolonize it. Also, what it does is it directly addresses and dismantles white supremacy culture and individualist thought in our instruction and in our classrooms. And we'll touch on that in just a few moments. It also empowers students with hands-on instruction, inquiry-based learning, and project design opportunities. So no worksheets or very little worksheets, lab reports are kind of thrown out the window. We are getting hands-on, we are getting authentic, and we are learning from our experiences in that space. It also provides realistic insight and opportunity for students to pursue STEM education, of course, in K-12 and beyond. So making sure that we provide positive experiences for our students. It encourages for our students to become critical thinkers instead of rote memorizers. And it also helps to foster soft skills authentically. Things like collaboration, communication, creativity. All of this is interwoven with the framework of culturally responsive STEM education. So I'd be remiss, of course, with talking about this if I didn't talk about the white supremacy culture traits. And these are going to be available to you. I've shared the link with Pear Deck. That way you can have this as a resource. And you might have seen this circulating around the internet. It's used a lot in anti-racist teaching and learning. These are the 15 characteristics of white supremacy culture. Now, I'm not going to read all of them because, of course, y'all can read, but what I am going to do is point out a couple of characteristics that specifically relate to STEM as a discipline, and then how that could impact, of course, who we are as educators, and of course, what we do with our students. So let's talk a little bit about perfectionism, because I think in STEM, this is the one that honestly runs the most rampant. I know as an educator and as a facilitator myself, even as an adult, sometimes I'm very nervous about being right. If I'm asked to go to the board, if I'm asked to say something, I don't want to sound ignorant. I don't want to sound like I don't know, what I'm doing. And then also there's that accountability aspect where if I am wrong, I don't want to internalize that mistake because I'm not the mistake, right? I just made a mistake. Perfectionism rears its head in STEM in a lot of different ways, but particularly with the culture and climate that it cultivates regarding having all A's. That's definitely one of the biggest ones. Not only that, but getting everything right all the time. I see this a lot specifically in science and mathematics instruction, especially with math, with attitudes surrounding math anxiety. If they're not perfect the first time, then they're a mistake, they're not good at it. So the idea of perfectionism and being perfect and being pigeonholed into this one area doesn't set our students up for success. And that kind of framework is detrimental to authentic growth of our students and also of us as well. Also, sense of urgency. A lot of what happens in STEM needs to be happening on a very crunched time frame or time curriculum. That comes, especially in the secondary area, from standardized testing. It also comes from college and career readiness. But even at the elementary level, there are still traits of that sense of urgency, right? If a student isn't adding or subtracting or, isn't familiar with algebra by the time that they reach high school, and I'm talking Algebra 1, they're often put into an applied math class. Sometimes there's additional support, but they're kind of pigeonholed as not understanding when really they might just not have had the opportunity or even the resources to understand. STEM, like all other disciplines, kids are going to get it at certain stages, specifically within their academic career, and the sense of urgency isn't going to help anybody in that space. Worship of the written word is another one that also runs pretty rampant. Specifically with STEM, I'm thinking lab papers, science tests, math tests. So much of what we do in STEM has to be on paper, and it's almost as if it's not written down, then it doesn't exist. Personally, as an educator, if a student can explain to me, how to say a math problem or how they completed a lab, in addition to, or maybe even removing the element of the lab paper, the paper pencil test, we also need to recognize these methods of communication as valid and not just worship or give credit to those that are only on paper. And then last but not least, the last one that I'm going to touch on is either or thinking. I'm saying this for STEM because as our students grow up, there is a lot of either or thinking between STEM and the humanities. We have students that feel like they're either this or that. I'm good at math, I'm not good at ELA. I'm good at science, I'm not good at history. That kind of either or thinking, and also the hierarchy of how STEM is typically put on a pedestal in jobs and careers, right? A lot of students already see that and they know that narrative, and that definitely breeds either or thinking within our work that we have. Now, this is really important because when we talk about how this relates to STEM at large, as educators, of course, we do our own things in our classrooms, but we only have what we have for a finite amount of time. Our students are going to move on to different grade levels. And on top of that, they're also going to move on to college and career. So here are a couple of examples that I've picked specifically that not only tie into the framework, but also just kind of face the realities of what our students are going to walk into. Starting first with one of my favorites, Science Has a Racism Problem. So this is from Cell Press, a great resource, but they are literally committed to publishing and disseminating work about all scientists. What's interesting about this paper is that they are 13 scientists, not one of them are Black. So underrepresentation of Black scientists is what they were looking at here. And they decided to take a stance that science has a racism problem. They also blatantly admitted that as scientists and as people in STEM, they are also part of the problem because they're not pressing for change on a daily basis. So what does change look like for them? Representation, obviously, featuring and amplifying Black and other underrepresented minority authors on social media, in conferences, and just in day-to-day life with work. Educating themselves and also others. And of course, participating in things like anti-racist, anti-bias training. However, this is a fairly recent paper. So if these issues have been existing for quite a bit of time, there was obviously an impetus to start to do this now. I sincerely hope the work continues, but it should have been there in the first place. This is another one from Microsoft. So this has been circulating around as well. So there was an initiative not too long ago where Microsoft is attempting to double the number of Black and African American managers, senior leadership members in the United States by 2025. My first gut reaction when reading this was, first of all, why would it take until 2025? Right, it's 2020, that's 5 years just to double it. And then the second thing that came to my mind was, why is it that we don't have more Black and brown and people of color in tech? I feel like this is an issue that is consistently brought up over and over and over again. There's the recruitment, but there's not the retaining, right? They want to include representation of culture. They want to engage in the ecosystem. They want to strengthen communities, but the community itself is not there. And as a person, when I look for employment or when I look to consult or, even if I look to speak, that's also something that I look for as a person of color myself. And then the third one that we're going to go over is another wonderful resource from The Atlantic. And again, as a math teacher, most of my resources are math, but I think this can be applied to anything. Math education and STEM education has a race problem. And a lot of the discussion of race in math education has centered around the perceived underperformance of certain groups of students and their disparate access to honors, gifted, advanced, AP, IB, whatever you happen to have at your schools. What's happening with this is that this is perpetuating racism in our schools, and it's shaping the expectations and kinds of mathematics that students experience, right? From applied math to AP calculus, there are certain disparities that indefinitely exist. And then as educators, how can we combat that, right? What do we do? So here are some things that we can do. I do a lot of work on making STEM curriculum what I call culturally responsive and accessible. This is what it means, and these are my 4 guidelines. Academic success and cultural relevance need to work together. This cannot be an either or, this needs to be a both and. Your curriculum, of course, needs to be sound, but it also needs to be culturally relevant and break down those barriers of white supremacy. Things like perfectionism, things like either or thinking, things like individualist thought. Make it work together. And Pear Deck is a great tool, and I'll show you how I used it in my classroom. Also, something that anybody can do on any level in their learning is that you can dive deep into STEM discoveries, findings, and achievements in non-Eurocentric cultures, right? Not focusing on the Eurocentric tendencies, go outside of that box, seek out Black and brown and people of color that are doing wonderful things in STEM. Invite them either through Skype in the classroom, face-to-face, if any of you are face-to-face. There are lots of neat ways to have that in your classroom, and such an easy and authentic way to have this space for students to learn authentically. Also, integrate collectivist thought into your instruction, activities, and assessments. Individualist thought is exactly that. It's individualist. Collectivist thought is collaborative. It places an emphasis on the good of the group. And not only that, but it is great to have authentic and hands-on learning experiences for students. Now, virtually, that's going to look a little different, but that collaborative aspect is still there in a collectivist classroom. So instead of worksheets or reading independently or, a project where it's just one person doing one thing, there are lots of ways to spice it up and bring that authenticity into STEM. And then, as always, give opportunities for student choice and agency. Once your students take more ownership of what they do, it makes it a better, more positive learning experience in that space. So this is how we can actionably make curriculum more culturally responsive and accessible. Here's how Pear Deck can help. Now, I am a Pear Deck stan. I love, love, love Pear Deck and have been using it for years. These are like my 4 things that I do for decolonizing and having this culturally responsive curriculum. Pear Deck is a wonderful tool, but it also doesn't do everything, right? No tool does everything. What Pear Deck does do is it opens up that gateway in a virtual space for your kids to engage in topics like this. So it's opportunities for sustained inquiry, reflection, and growth. The Pear Deck templates are absolutely wonderful. And I'm also, I have 3 templates that are going to be shared with you that we'll go over in a few moments that I've used for this purpose. Also, the responses are anonymous. So they help with collectivist thought. That element of perfectionism is taken away to a certain degree because your name is no longer attached to it. If you are drawing on a number line and if your answer is wrong, your name is not attached to it, so nobody can say that Victoria did it wrong. Instead, the teacher or the class might use that as an opportunity to talk through the mistake and correct it. And I've seen that happen in my classroom multiple times. Also, it helps to foster collaborative attitudes and a growth mindset. If you use Pear Deck as a tool over the course of your classroom and your learning, you can see that growth with your students. Also, templates for response, shared experiences, and critical thinking. Again, tying in that collectivist thought and breaking down those barriers for our students. And it's also got a lot of authentic opportunities for student choice and voice. So with that being said, I think this is the perfect opportunity to hop into the first example. So as I mentioned before, I am a former math educator. And I'm going to go ahead, and my computer's being kind of slow. I am pulling up an activity that I did with my Algebra 1 students not too long ago. And what I'm going to do is share my properties of real numbers. Now, as I go ahead and pull this up, I know that as a woman of color and as a math teacher, it does get kind of squirrely because I want representation, right? Like I want inclusion. Even though I'm removed from that, or I was as a teacher, even though I don't have that power, I can at least make my curriculum more inclusive. And I think that's what Pear Deck does. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen on my Chrome tab, properties of real numbers. There we go. So this was an entry level. By the time that students reach Algebra 1, there is an assumed understanding that they know what this kind of stuff is. The operative word here is assumed because I found that most of my students had no idea what this was. And again, that's my job as an educator to rectify that. I don't look at them and say, how do you not know about real numbers and you're in 9th grade? I look at that and say, what can I do to support you and what can I do to help you? So that's what I did. They were kind of familiar with properties of real numbers previously. So Pear Deck has a slide that's just kind of a wondering slide. We entered with the class and talked about what we knew about real numbers. We were able to record responses as a group, and with that collectivist and collaborative thought, have that conversation together. We also completed a concept map on paper. And I know that Pear Deck has concept map templates, but I did want them to have it like paper pencil for the concept map of just key things and key wonderings that we had throughout the course of that conversation. That way we can revisit those questions and answer them later on. So that was a really great experience. Once we had that conversation and we did the concept mapping, I asked for them to either draw or type 2 examples of real numbers. And again, what I wanted them to do was just share out loud, via Pear Deck. It's anonymous. That way it is, perfectly fine. If somebody makes a mistake, we can talk through it. And that element of perfectionism is taken away a little bit. From there, what we did together is we did a detailed dive into properties of real numbers: commutative, associative, distributive. And then all throughout the course of that, because I was presenting in the instructor-led mode, so that's whole class, I did checks for understanding over the course of it to check for progress. So it was really simple, honestly, to put the templates in. And they loved the interactive element. A lot of what I get when I give PD for STEM is that STEM tends to be lecture that's not interactive, or maybe it's just, like a teacher writing on the board the whole time, and then the students taking notes, and that's class, right? This makes it more responsive, more authentic, and more engaging for your students. We did an activity with a number line. We were demonstrating the additive property. We were creating problems ourselves. And what I actually did for this one, for student agency and choice, is I actually picked one of these problems, and that was for our warm-up for the next day. So they really enjoyed seeing their problems being utilized, and that was so empowering for them to see. So this is properties of real numbers, and this is for Algebra 1. And again, that link is available to you. Next, I'm going to go ahead and share my relations and functions. Getting there. Chrome tab, relations and functions. There we go. So this was a little bit different. This was something that I did with my Algebra 2 course. So Algebra 2 is typically taken in junior year of school. And again, the assumed goal was that, okay, you have a little bit of information about what a relation is and what a function is. And again, the operative word there is assumed. Something I've also found interesting with STEM curriculum is that sometimes it jumps, right? So Algebra 1 geometry, Algebra 2 is typically how it goes. So if I taught juniors, they had that geometry year in the middle. And I love geometry. Geometry is fabulous, but some of that Algebra 1 was lost. So again, instead of saying, how do you not know what a relation or function is, my reaction as an educator is, what can I do to support you and how can I help? Okay, so this is relations and functions that I did. And Pear Deck's got a lot of cool templates that are all purpose and also by subject. I actually stole this template, this specific one with the Venn diagram, from the ELA templates. So you can totally double dip. If you find a set of templates, in another subject area, you can totally repurpose them and use them for your learning. So I opened it up again with a collectivist discussion. What do we know about relations? What do we know about functions? And then what do we know about both? And we use this as an opportunity as a class to kind of draw on those prior learnings. And we were able to figure out what we understood, and then not only that, where we needed to go. I taught 2 courses of Algebra 2 last year. My first class, wonderful with it. So I was actually able to use that to inform my instruction. My second class needed a little bit more. So that's where we get to the whole group part. So we talked about how we've discussed variables and relationships. I give examples like height versus weight, distance versus time. Then we get into definitions, right? What's a relation? What's a function? And then this is where Pear Deck becomes really cool because so much of math is applicable and can be drawn. And they loved the fact that all the colors would pop up and they could draw all over. They could do so many cool things. So I really found that to be a powerful tool in my classroom as well. We talk about domain and range, what the domain is, what range is, what that looks like. And then again, I screen grabbed and stole this directly from the ELA templates. So you'll notice it says correct the sentence. Not usually something you do in STEM, but it totally works here. We just went over a definition for domain. Domain is going to be all of the X values. Right here, it says that the domain displays all of the Y values. So we're taking it out of the box a little bit, right? We are really deconstructing it and not just saying, here's domain, here's range, here's a relation, here's a function. We are deconstructing it and looking at math in different ways. And I remember when I did this with students, and I've done it with like STEM as a whole as well, they're initially very confused as to why they have to correct a sentence, because usually you do it in ELA, right? You don't really do it in STEM. But this provides opportunities for tie-in. It provides opportunities for just interdisciplinary work. And there's a lot of cool things that can be done when you look at the other templates and you modify them. We also talk a little bit, and this is just the rest of it, like what's function notation? Think of a function like a machine. Most of them were familiar with like input output from elementary school. So this was more of like a reinforcement activity that I did with them. But I like to show this because it demonstrates that you can use templates that are not necessarily in like the STEM realm. Like it doesn't have to be science. It doesn't have to be math. You can do and pick from any template. All right, so my last one is my favorite one, and you're also going to have the opportunity to have this as well. And the topic is gender and racial bias in mathematics. So with that, go ahead, Chrome tab, share screen, share. Okay, I created this because at my old school, it was an IB school. So that's International Baccalaureate. And we have a program called TOK. So TOK is called Theory of Knowledge. And essentially teachers from different disciplines will come in and, teach things about like inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, lots of cool stuff. But they kind of looked at me and said, Victoria, you can pick whatever topic you want. And I remember looking at them and saying, are you sure? Because I knew that it was going to be this. It is really important for me that even though I don't have hiring power, I don't make decisions on diversity and inclusion, I can make conscious choices in my curriculum and in my teaching to still have that inclusivity and have that culturally responsive element. So that's why I created this. It is gender and racial bias in mathematics. And again, this is available to you. So we kick it off with a Pear Deck template on why bias might exist in STEM. So I start with the big STEM umbrella. I really like this critical thinking template because it ties in point of view. So my point of view, another point of view. I was teaching at an all-girls school at the time. So there were a lot of course, conceptions of being girls in STEM, what that might look like, how they're compared to their peers in the boys' school. So this was able to generate just lots of neat discussion about not just bias that they perceive, but also bias that they already had based off of their, relationship with STEM. We go into big questions. I like to ask, specifically with just being culturally relevant, it's always a good idea to remember these big three, right? Who's telling the story? Why is the story being told? And then how do we want the story remembered, right? And we were learning about Pythagoras at the time. And this was what I did with my TOK students. And we talk about Pythagorean theorem. Who told the story? Why was the story told? And then how was the story remembered? If you've done research on Pythagoras or his theorem, in his book, he explicitly talks about learning about it from his travels in Nubia, which is Africa. So even though we do accredit the theory to him, of course, there were other Black and brown mathematicians that led him to that point. Where's the credit for them, right? And then we begin to have a conversation about why things happen and why stories are told the way that they are. We talk a little bit then about what they know about Pythagoras from what I've told them, because I do not hold back when I teach, and also what they know about the Pythagorean theorem. So this is less like content-based and more, let's think about our profession and how to break down those barriers, right? I give historical background and context for just typical biases all throughout STEM and also throughout math. We talk a little bit about two things that they've learned so far, because to me, that's very, very, very important. Checking for learning. And then we talk a little bit about the myth of racial hierarchy and mathematic ability, specifically the Pythagorean theorem, because we've talked about that. I always talk about the, aliens made the pyramids, theory, because that puts Black and brown mathematicians and scientists and STEMists at a disadvantage. We are discrediting the work that folks did way before us. And again, that comes from worship of the written word. A lot of this was not written down. Like the math was passed down orally. It wasn't necessarily written down. So it discredits the work that everyone has done before us to create these pyramids. And that's an eye-opener for them at that point. We also talk a little bit about the myth of gender hierarchy and mathematical ability. I open with Hidden Figures because at that point, most of my kids had seen that movie. And then we also talk about many, many, many more folks across the gender spectrum that have been heavily involved in math and math achievement. And it was eye-opening again for them to see themselves in these roles and know that even though the bias exists, there are trailblazers that are there before us, and there are also things that we can do to dismantle those systems. I close out with the math memoir, which is something I do with all of my students. And the Pear Deck team, I might want to send y'all that link. That way they have the link to the memoir. I think it's just a good resource. And even if you're not math, even if you're not STEM, it can easily be used, for any type of topic. I do memoirs with my students at the beginning of every semester. And then it carries out throughout the course of the year. Memoirs are just quick, we do them bi-weekly, and they are personal to the student. So it's a lot of thinking, right, about their thinking in STEM, and a lot of thinking about their growth over the course of the year. This is kept private to the student, but during conferences, or maybe if they're disappointed with their grade or disappointed with their effort, they can look through the memoir. And if they so choose, I call that challenge by choice. They're welcome to bring up things with the memoir for me. So this is just quick 3 steps. We're thinking about what inspired them, what challenged them, what sat well with their soul, what didn't sit well with them, in about 3 minutes. Then they were going to be sharing out one challenge, learning, or growth opportunity, because again, these were juniors, okay? They were about to enter college or career. It was on the horizon. They had a lot of really good comments about what they can do moving forward. And then for the third step, in 2 to 3 paragraphs, they were to reflect on their thinking in their math memoir. When they finished early, they got to go to breakfast. I'm like, everybody go eat. But it was a really neat experience to use Pear Deck in order for them to facilitate that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to flip back to my culturally responsive STEM education, because before we hop into Q&A, I want y'all to have my contact information in case you have any questions or you'd like any resources. Some of y'all know me from Twitter, where I'm very active and talk about the right to free bread at restaurants, and my wife, Courtney, and all of the fun stuff that I do with math and tech and education. You can find me at Victoria the Tech, and my email is just my full name, Victoria Rose Thompson @gmail.com. So while this is up, Pear Deck team, I am ready for Q&A. Okay, I see. Please share questions for Victoria here in the chat. Yay. I saw one question earlier as I was switching. The math memoir template is digital. So when I share that, you can have that and you can just kind of mix match, all that very fun stuff. When it comes to Hidden Figures, yes, Hollywood does change some of the facts. So Hidden Figures has better truths than what was shown in the movie, which is absolutely correct. I like to use it, and for context, because I want to unpack that a little bit, I use that as a jumping point to first recognize that most of us didn't know that Black women got us to the moon until that movie, which I think is unacceptable for us, as a curriculum. And then for the second part, once you watch the movie, I want you to do more research and figure out what else went on in that space, because there's so much more, that went on than what meets the eye. So media can be used as a jumping point, but I always encourage students, and I give resources for them to do their research as well. I don't have any experience with early childhood. My earliest, I'd say, is 3rd grade, but these can easily be applied. All you'd have to do is some tweaking of the language and also maybe some tweaking of the templates. And I got a really good question. Is the math memoir a tool to take math notes? It is actually separate from their note-taking. So they have like their note taking that's either in OneNote or maybe it is like paper pencil. I'm a little lenient with how I have them do it because every student learns differently and uses different tools. However, the math memoir is kept separate from what they use for the notes. Okay, I got a good question. Can you please share classroom norms? Let me see if I have some of mine. Um, I actually, so I'll unpack the word norms. I don't like to use the word norms. I like to use the term rather like shared ideals, because we actually come up with them together as a class. Of course, I've got some that are non-negotiable for me, just based off of like school safety and also, of course, for the best interest of the learning of the group. However, let's see. I usually have four. First day. It's ironic because on the first day of school last year, my projector wasn't working, but all of my students had technology, so I did use Pear Deck. So these were the four that I used with them, and we actually all came up with these together. So be respectful, be safe, be prepared, and then be ready to learn. And these were ones that as a class, like as an Algebra 2 class, we came up with together. Respectful means being respectful of ourselves and of course of the teacher, but also respect doesn't mean authority. Respect means also if you respect yourself enough, please speak up. I want to hear, right? We're being respectful of each other. We're also monitoring our time. Being safe, not that like safety is that big of a concern with math class, but I think of be safe in that respect as this is a safe space to learn and grow and collaborate. If you feel like that is not happening, please speak up or see me privately. That way we all have a safe experience in this room. Also be prepared, come to class with your materials, and if you don't have them, just let me know. That way we can figure it out. And then be ready to learn. Showing up with your authentic self. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're responsible for positive energy when you enter this space, because sometimes you don't have positive energy when you come into this space. But what I am asking for you to do is be ready to learn. And if you can't be ready, then please let me know so we can figure out what we need to do. Okay. What are the best resources for advanced placement science teachers to integrate meaningful lessons on diversity within our scopes? Ooh, that's a really good question. I always start with white supremacy framework. Always, always, always. The second thing that I like to do is I look for resources regarding problem-based learning and project-based learning, because that's going to be authentic ways for students to not only have that space to create, learn, and get hands-on, but also pick, words are escaping me right now, pick topics that are meaningful to them in that space. What I usually do is I start with problem-based learning and then I go to project-based learning, because project-based learning is definitely more, collectivist. It is students picking their passion projects. The teacher is more of a guide on the side than a sage on the stage. Problem-based learning is something that is more handheld by the teacher and can purposely interject diversity in there. And Pear Deck team, I can totally send resources for that as well. That way the folks here have them. Can the memoir be done audibly? Yes. So I've had students with the accessibility, sometimes with motor skills, they can't write. What I would do in that space is I would actually have them sit down and have time with me. We block off about 10, 15 minutes worth of time. If they wanted to do it in front of me, because some of them also didn't know how to work the technology, I would just kind of like press play and then run away and then come back. Or for those students that wanted to do it audibly, like via phone technology, or maybe keep it on OneNote or whatever, I also let them do that as well. My only request was that they followed the template for the math memoir. The template, of course, meaning the guiding questions, but anything other than that is fair game. Any special tips for working with English language learners as you do this work? Ooh, that's a good question. Well, I think personally one of my best tools is using the Pear Deck visuals. So the ones where it's not necessarily with the words, just using the drawing tools, using just different types of techniques and technologies to get them to interact. Microsoft also has a lot of really neat tools like Translator, Immersive Reader, and Picture Dictionary that help as well. So I really think that that is paramount. My best tip for working with English language learners is that nothing can be assumed, period. Nothing can be assumed, nothing should be assumed. So we've got to make sure that we understand that, and we need to unpack our bias. We need to make sure that we understand where they're coming from and work our best to make sure that we understand how they learn and what we can do to support them. Culturally responsive resources for middle school science, yes. So Pear Deck has actually dropped them in there, and then I've got resources that I'm going to share as well. That way it runs the gamut. Elaborate on a few of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. Ooh, I've got time for one because I actually have another PD. It's actually very fun. My institute that I'm working with, we're putting on like a week-long, like anti-racist, project-based learning. I wish y'all were here. It's so much fun. But let me go ahead and bring up those traits one more time. And then I'll say thanks to the folks at Pear Deck for letting me present today. It was so wonderful. I'm going to speak about the one that I think not only resonates with me the best, but also I think really resonates as us as teachers and with students in the classroom, and that's fear of open conflict. Fear of open conflict, I think, is huge. There's a power imbalance that is between, of course, administration and teachers, and then that between teachers and students. The sooner that we recognize that power imbalance, I think that the easier it's going to be to debunk some of these traits and also some of these things. However, when I think fear of open conflict, when it comes from student to teacher, I think of how many times I've worked with students where they're afraid to come to me. And it's not because they don't view me as being like approachable. It's not because they think that I'm going to yell at them. Like they know how I operate. They're just so afraid that more is going to come from that experience. And, if they're asking me a question about a math problem and, maybe they like I encourage them to push their thinking or have more questions about that, that's something that is viewed as open conflict in that space. Another thing that I see a lot between just teachers and administrators is that fear of open conflict, right? Like I want to say something, but I don't know if it's going to open the can of worms, or I want to do this and I don't know if it's going to lead to that. So the fear of open conflict is huge. And that directly plays into the power hoarding. I saw somebody mention that. I feel like I can't talk about the fear of open conflict without power hoarding. Power hoarding means that those who are in power have the power, keep the power, and don't like for the power to be dispersed. So again, that's that power imbalance between admin, teacher, student, right? How do we make experiences more equitable? And that's why we do things like having anonymous responses through Pear Deck, creating a collectivist classroom experience, things like creating shared experiences and shared ideals as a class instead of a teacher just kind of setting class rules for the students to go by. When power is shared, we all have agency. So that is fear of open conflict, and it's also the power hoarding. So I hope that helped to clear some things up. If anybody wants to talk more, I'm always open to talk more. If you want specific resources, you want to talk a little bit about these traits and how they impact classrooms, especially like K-12 and beyond. I do a lot of research as well on just attitudes of how that impacts, if students want to go into STEM, if they go into STEM post-college. So I'm always down to talk and communicate. But thank you so much for the experience. Thank you for being wonderful. Thank you for listening. And I'm going to turn it over to the folks at Pear Deck.